The month of October is Filipino American History Month. This is a chance for us to celebrate the contributions of the Filipino American community. It's also an opportunity for us to learn a little bit about the rich culture and history of Filipinos. Filipinos have had a lot of struggles here in the United States, so Filipino American History Month is a chance for us to remember those struggles and also to share and talk about the unique experiences of Filipino Americans. So today, in celebration of Filipino American History Month, I'm going to talk about why there's so many Filipino nurses. This is a really fascinating history. Not only are there a lot of Filipino nurses here in the United States, but Filipino nurses are all over the world serving as frontline healthcare workers. But to understand this story, you have to go back in time. You really do have to interrogate and investigate U.S. American colonialism. Before the Spanish invade the Philippines was a free and autonomous territory. You had several different indigenous groups living freely on their homelands, practicing their culture. Of course, all of this changes when Spanish colonizers invade. Like all colonizing forces, they come into Philippine territory and force Filipinos to adopt Spanish, to become Christians, to adopt Catholicism. Now, don't get me wrong, Filipinos fight back bravely. In fact, for centuries, Filipinos fight the Spanish in an attempt to remain free and autonomous. All right, so let's fast forward to the Spanish-American War of 1898. This is a time when U.S. imperialism really begins to kick off. Now, the Americans had been imperialists and colonizers really from the get-go. They had destroyed Native American society after Native American society. They had invaded Mexico and taken over Mexican territories, but they wanted to take their imperialist agenda to a completely new global level. This resulted, again, in the Spanish-American War. And in the Philippines, they encouraged Filipinos to take up arms against the Spanish, which they did. The Filipinos, however, were looking for their own liberation. They were looking to free the Filipinos from Spanish rule. Even though the Filipinos declared their independence in the Philippines, the United States did not want to recognize it. The United States wanted the Philippines. So through the Treaty of Paris, signed with the Spanish, for $20 million, the United States was able to take the Philippines, Guam, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. The Filipinos nonetheless wanted their independence. They wanted their freedom. They didn't want to be colonized any longer. So they attempted to win their independence through fighting a guerrilla war with the United States. This guerrilla war was absolutely brutal. Now, this is a history that I did not know until recently. The Filipinos fought really hard. They again engaged in a guerrilla war against the United States, and the United States brutalized Filipinos, killing 250,000 Filipinos in the process. Most historians are going to tell you that the Filipino-American War ended in 1902, but this isn't true. Filipinos fought for about another decade. Filipinos wanted their freedom, they wanted their liberation. And so throughout the Philippines, especially in the South, you had Filipino communities who fought the Americans and continued to wage war so that way they could be free. The American colonization of the Philippines is very similar and reminiscent of the colonization of Native Americans here in North America. There were several massacres committed against Filipinos. We're talking about mass hangings, tortures, the sexual assault of indigenous Filipino women, the killing of innocent children. Again, when I think about American colonization here in the US, I think about wars of extermination. And basically the same thing happened in the Philippines. One particular massacre that has really stood out for me, because I think it's really similar to the massacres that took place here in the Americas against Native Americans, was the massacre against a group of Filipinos called Moros. This group of people were living independently in the southern part of the Philippines, and the United States had drove them into a volcanic crater, and they completely bombarded this area. Now, there were women and children there, and it's estimated that at least 900 women, children, and Filipinos were killed in this crater by American soldiers. There's an iconic picture of American soldiers overlooking hundreds of dead bodies, hundreds of dead Filipinos. We have to remember this is the peak of white supremacy and this notion that Western civilization is superior to all other cultures. So wherever Europeans go, they view the indigenous populations as savages. There's an attitude that Europeans have to go around the world uplifting people of color, lifting us out of our savage ways so that way we can become civilized. So you're probably thinking, what does this have to do with Filipino nurses? Well, the Americans, when they colonized the Philippines, they attempt to assimilate Filipinos through creating schools and education programs. And part of these assimilation programs, they create schools that are meant to train Filipinos to become nurses. And so from here, you see this new tradition of Filipinos in nursing. In addition to being trained to become nurses, Filipinos were also taught English as well. All right, so let's jump to 1948. This is 2 years after Filipinos finally win their independence from American colonial rule. This is also 3 years after the end of World War II. We're seeing the beginning of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And to combat Soviet propaganda, the United States creates an exchange program which allows people from around the world to come to the United States to learn about American culture for 2 years. And during this time, you see a lot of Filipino nurses migrate to the United States. They're already trained in nursing, and so they're ready to go. They're ready to be put to work. Then in 1968, the United States passes the Immigration and Nationality Act, which allowed large numbers of immigrants from around the world to come to the United States. Now keep in mind, there's a major shortage of nurses here in the US. So this opens the door for a lot of Filipinos to come here and earn a pretty decent living. In fact, there were a lot of American hospitals that were advertising to Filipino nurses to come to the United States. They wanted Filipinos to come here to work in hospitals because there was, again, a major shortage of nurses. And of course, Filipinos answered the call. Even though American hospitals wanted access to Filipino nurses, Filipinos faced a lot of discrimination. The American Nursing Association added new licensing requirements to limit Filipino entry into the United States. Discrimination was prevalent. Filipino nurses ended up in underpaid and lower status positions. Filipino nurses here in the United States have faced exploitation, wage discrimination, and even human trafficking. In 2019, 200 Filipino nurses won a human trafficking lawsuit in which they alleged that the owners of a group of New York nursing homes were not paid the wages promised in their contracts and were forced to work in unsafe conditions with inadequate staffing. White supremacy up to its old tricks. Filipino nurses here in the United States have a long history of doing some of the most difficult and arduous nursing jobs like bedside care and critical care work. They were on the front lines of the AIDS crisis, and they've been on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic. About 1/3 of all foreign-born nurses here in the United States are Filipino. Also, since the 1960s, about 150,000 Filipino nurses have migrated to the United States looking for nursing jobs. This is what I think everybody should know. Filipino nurses are our unsung heroes. Every single year, nearly 20,000 Filipino nurses leave the Philippines to travel not just to the United States, but to other countries to work on the front lines of our healthcare systems, doing so even though they're being underpaid. In fact, during the pandemic, many retired Filipino nurses came out of retirement just to help. And sadly, because Filipinos are on the front lines of the COVID pandemic, about 1/3 of all nurses who contracted COVID-19 and died were Filipino. Again, these are our unsung heroes. There you have it, an absolutely fascinating history of Filipino nursing here in the United States. If you like the content here, please subscribe, like, and share. And happy Filipino American History Month.